You took about 4,000 steps yesterday, give or take. You didn't decide on a single one of them. You didn't budget for them, plan a route, or check whether the route was survivable. You stood up, the floor moved past you, and you thought about something else the entire time. Now go stand on a dry lake bed in southern New Mexico. There's a flat there, at a place called White Sands, that used to be the muddy edge of a lake, and pressed into it is a line of footprints running 1.5 miles in one direction. Bare feet, small ones, made by a woman or possibly by an adolescent boy, because the anatomy won't quite let you say. Over 400 prints. It is the longest human trackway of its age anybody has ever found. The person was moving fast, not a jog, close to it. You can tell because the ground was wet and the feet were sliding, and the slip is baked into every step. You can also tell they were carrying something heavy because the prints splay out and the load sits over one hip and then, a while later, over the other. They were switching arms. Every so often, a second set of prints shows up beside the first, tiny ones. A toddler sat down for a moment, then picked back up. A few hours after this person went north, a mammoth walked across the fresh tracks without any apparent interest. A giant ground sloth crossed too, and the sloth's prints show it rearing up and turning, sniffing the air, working out what had come through ahead of it. That flat also carries dire wolf tracks. And American lion. Then the same bare feet come back down the same line. Same speed, same route, reversed. No child. We have no idea what happened at the far end. The site itself has been dated, argued over, and then dated again by 2 more methods that both agreed with the first. The human tracks there come out somewhere around 21 to 23,000 years old. Here's what I keep coming back to. We tell the history of human movement as an adventure story. Brave people, big horizons, the itch to see what's over the hill. That story got written afterward, once moving got cheap. It did not come from the people doing the moving, because nobody walks like that out of curiosity. Every mile our species ever covered, somebody paid for. Sometimes it was us. Usually it was something else. So let's go through the bill, line by line, starting with the machine that did the walking. Your body is, mechanically, very good at this. The arch in your foot is a spring. It flattens under your weight and snaps back and hands you a piece of that energy for free. Your Achilles does the same thing on a bigger scale. At the back of your neck, there's a strip of elastic tissue called the nuchal ligament, which keeps your head from bobbing while everything underneath it is bouncing. Chimps don't have one. The earliest members of our family tree didn't either. It shows up around the time the running does. Then there's the cooling. You have somewhere between 2 and 4 million sweat glands and almost no fur, which is a combination nothing else your size has. Every other large mammal out on an open plain sheds heat by panting, and you can't pant and gallop at the same time. The breathing and the stride get locked together. So they run, and they overheat, and they stop. You don't stop, you leak, and it costs. It still costs. Your lower back is a column that spent most of its evolutionary history hanging horizontally and now stands vertical under compression, and it fails on a schedule. Your knees take the entire load through one hinge that isn't allowed to rotate. Your arches fall. The price of admission for this body was chronic mechanical failure in the exact parts that hold you up, and we've been paying it for millions of years with no option to decline. Which raises a question the anatomy doesn't answer by itself. Endurance for what? The leading idea, laid out in 2004 by Dennis Bramble and Daniel Lieberman, is that this isn't a travel adaptation at all. It's a hunting adaptation. The proposal is that we ran animals to death, followed them, in heat, at a pace they couldn't hold, until they cooked themselves and quit, and then walked up and finished it. People have been arguing about it ever since, and the objections are fair. Running burns more than walking, so on paper it looks like a bad trade. And recorded cases of anyone doing this, observed by outsiders, are thin, maybe a dozen. Then in 2024, a team went back through the ethnographic and historical record and pulled out close to 400 accounts of endurance pursuits from more than 270 places around the world, and made the case that under the right conditions, the returns hold up fine against every other pre-modern method. So it isn't settled, but sit with the shape of it. If it's right, the thing your body is tuned for isn't going somewhere. It's following. You are not built to escape. You're built to be the thing that doesn't stop coming. Now, the footprints everybody knows about. In 1978, Mary Leakey's team found 3 sets of tracks at Laetoli, in Tanzania, pressed into volcanic ash 3.66 million years ago. 2 adults and a smaller individual walking upright. It's the oldest clear evidence of full bipedalism we have. It's on the wall of every museum that can afford a cast. And it gets called the first human footprints. 2 years before that, at the same site, they found something else. 5 prints at a spot labeled Site A, also bipedal, also in the same ash. But the shape was wrong, and the gait was strange. Whatever made them was crossing its feet over the midline as it walked, left over right, like somebody on a runway. Nobody knew what to do with that. The assumption at the time was that only one kind of hominin existed at a time, and this didn't look like the Site G animal, so the prints got written off, probably a bear, standing up for a few steps. Then they got buried, and then they got lost, and nobody looked at them again for 40 years. In 2019, a team relocated them, cleaned them, and scanned them. And to test the bear question, they did something I find hard not to love. They found black bear cubs with feet the right size, bribed them with maple syrup and applesauce, and walked them through a tray of mud. Bears don't match. A bear's heel tapers. Their hips and knees make them wobble side to side, which puts their steps wide apart. The Site A prints have a broad heel, a big toe, and a narrow step width, published in Nature in 2021. Site A was a hominin. A different one. Something else. Walking a different way on the same ash within the same few days. So the oldest evidence of walking isn't a breakthrough story, it's a crowded field. There were multiple kinds of upright animal out there trying it, in different bodies, with different gaits, and one lineage's version happens to be the one still standing. We call that version walking. The rest got filed under bear. So this animal walks out of Africa. Everybody knows that line. Here's the part that gets cut. It failed. Not once. Over and over. For something like 150,000 years. Mislia Cave in Israel. A piece of upper jaw, modern human, between 194 and 177,000 years old. Apodema in Greece. A fragment of skull argued at around 210,000, which is contested, but it's being contested by serious people. Then Skul and Qafse, also Israel, roughly 130 to 90,000 years back. And these people were not fumbling. At Skul, in the same layers as the bodies, there are shell beads. At Qafse, in a layer around 92,000 years old, someone had gathered shells with holes worn through them and was wearing them. They buried their dead with care. Genetically, they are gone. Every living person outside Africa traces the overwhelming bulk of their ancestry to one small population that got out around 50,000 years ago. Everybody before that, Mislia, Apodema, Skul, Qafse, left no detectable trace in anyone alive. One of the researchers on the Apodema work put it flatly, they died out and were probably replaced where they stood by Neanderthals. Some people push back on the word failed, and they've got a point. Judging a population by whether its DNA is still circulating 20,000 generations later is a savage way to keep score. Those people lived full lives. They had children. It just stops. But the question stands. Why did the last group work? For decades, the answers were about upgrades, better tools, language, symbols. The problem is the archaeology keeps shoving all of that further back. Complex weaponry has deep roots in Africa. Beads and pigment turn up long before 50,000 years ago. The groups that vanished had the upgrades. They vanished anyway. In 2025, a team led by Eleanor, Sari, and Andrea Manica came at it sideways. They assembled 479 dated archaeological layers from across Africa, covering the last 120,000 years, and ran the whole thing through the modeling ecologists use on any other species. Where does this animal live? And how wide is the band of conditions it tolerates? From about 70,000 years ago, that band blows open. Not one new frontier, all of them at once. Deep forest, high ground, real desert. Humans in Africa start showing up in habitats that had been off the menu for the entire history of the species, and they start doing it across the continent. That's the difference. The group that finally got out wasn't braver than the people at Qafse. It wasn't smarter. It had spent tens of thousands of years learning to live in places that were bad. The thing that let us take the planet is that we got good at being uncomfortable. Which brings me to the strangest object in this whole story. An island. Flores sits in the Indonesian archipelago, and it has never been attached to anything, not once. Drop the sea 100 meters for an ice age, and Flores is still an island, with open water between it and every other piece of land. There are stone tools on it with a minimum age of about 1 million years. The site is called Wolo Sege. The tools sit under an ash layer dated by argon decay to 1.02 million years. Further up the sequence, at Madamenge, there are more tools, and around 700,000 years ago, actual pieces of hominin. Teeth. A scrap of jaw. Small ones. And in 2025, it got worse. A team working at a site called Callio on Sulawesi pulled 7 stone flakes out of the ground and dated them to at least 1.04 million years. So the crossings happened. more than once. Across the Wallace Line, which is the biological boundary where Asia stops and something else starts, and which exists precisely because most things can't get over it. And they happened a million years ago, made by something that was not us, carrying a brain a fraction the size of yours. This is where the version you've heard goes romantic. Someone built a raft, someone stood on a beach, pointed at water they couldn't see across, and pushed off. The people who work on this don't think so. The raft isn't the problem. You can lash one together with Paleolithic tools, and researchers have gone out and proved it. The problem is intent. Aiming at land you cannot see takes planning, provisioning, and a reason to go, and nobody thinks the Wolosege toolmakers had that stack. The leading explanation is the same one used for how the rats got there. And the monkeys. Accident. An earthquake or a tsunami rips a chunk of forested riverbank loose, it floats, and there are passengers on it. That's not a guess out of nowhere. In the Indian Ocean tsunami of 2004, people were swept out to sea on floating debris and survived for a week or more. Some were picked up something like 150 kilometers offshore. We've watched the mechanism run in living memory. So what happened to whoever landed? Liang Bua Cave, 2003. Homo floresiensis. About a meter tall. Brain roughly the size of a chimpanzee's. The island took whatever washed up and shrank it. And it did that across the whole archipelago, in a gradient you can read like a receipt. Luzon had rhinos, buffalo, deer, pigs, 2 kinds of elephant. Sulawesi lost the rhinos. By the time you're down to Flores, you've got 1 dwarf elephant and a great many rats. That's the first sea crossing in the human story. Not a hero on the horizon. Something clinging to a tree, going wherever the water went. And the reward for surviving was to be locked on a rock that spent 500,000 years making it smaller. But there is one crossing that was on purpose. And it's better than the story you were told, and worse. Australia. At Majid Bebe, a rock shelter in Arnhem Land, the oldest claimed occupation date is 65,000 years, give or take about 6. That's disputed, and there's a live argument that nobody was there before 50. Either way, at some point, people crossed. Getting there was never one hop. It's a chain of crossings through the islands of Wallacea, and at least one leg approaches 100 kilometers of open ocean. You can't see the far side. So, accident again? No. And for once we can say that with numbers. Researchers ran drift models. They took the currents, the winds, the geometry of the islands, and asked a simple question. If you throw people into the water at random, what are the odds any of them wash up on Australia? Under 5% on any route, unless you're dumping 40 adults into the sea once every 20 years, forever. It doesn't happen at a rate that builds a continent. The ocean does not deliver you there, but choose your season and paddle. Even barely. Half a knot of headway, and the odds jump. Then there's who arrived. The genetics show at least 4 separate maternal lineages in the founding group. Each one needs 5 to 10 women of childbearing age to take hold, which puts you at dozens per lineage as a floor. Some researchers argue for hundreds, possibly thousands, all inside a window of a few centuries. Sit with what that means. Rafts holding 10 or more people plus food and water. Repeat voyages, 4 to 7 days at sea, time to the monsoon, done deliberately by people who had presumably sent somebody ahead and got word back. That's not a leap of faith. That's a logistics operation, run before agriculture, before pottery, before anything, and it is the first great maritime migration on record. It deserves every bit of awe it gets. And then, within a few thousand years, Australia's big animals stop existing. Diprotodon, a marsupial the size of a small car. Genornis, a flightless bird that made an emu look reasonable. Thylacoleo, the marsupial lion, which had the strongest bite for its size of any mammal we know about. All gone in a window that overlaps human arrival. The cause is still fought over. The climate was moving too, and fire regimes changed, and pinning it purely on hunting is more than the evidence carries. But the pattern repeats. That's the thing about it. Because now do the Pacific. Starting a few thousand years ago, the finest open water navigators in human history spread across the largest ocean on the planet. Double-hulled canoes, star compasses, reading swell direction through the hull with their bodies, watching the flight lines of birds at dusk, and the color on the underside of a cloud sitting over a lagoon they couldn't see yet. They found every habitable island out there. Modern sailors still can't fully account for how. I'm not going to undercut that. It's the most impressive thing anyone in this story does. Here's what rode along with it. Across the Pacific Islands, modeling puts the number of land bird species that went extinct after people arrived at a minimum of 983. Fold in the seabirds and songbirds, and the estimate climbs to around 1,300. That's roughly a tenth of the bird species on Earth. Birds that could fly survived about 30 times more often than birds that couldn't. New Zealand, around 1250. 9 species of moa, the biggest of them a quarter of a ton. All 9 gone inside about 300 years. One of them inside 100. And before you reach for climate, ancient DNA from the final 4,000 years of moa says the populations were large and healthy right up until the boats landed. They weren't in decline, they were fine. Then they weren't. Every island humans ever reached has a layer in it. Bones, then charcoal, then quiet. We didn't discover the Pacific. We ate it. Right. Walking took the ground, boats took the water. But the thing that held humans in place for 300,000 years was never distance. It was weight. A person can cover 20 miles in a day. Try it with a dead deer across your shoulders. Somewhere north of 20 kilos, your body starts filing complaints. And shortly after that, it starts filing injuries. Which means that for most of our history, the size of your world wasn't set by how far you could go. It was set by how much you could bring back. So, dragging. Throw the carcass on a hide and haul it. Then the travois, which is 2 long poles joined at the top with the load riding on the frame, narrow end over your shoulder. The ground takes most of the weight and you just steer. One person can move 100 pounds that way. And here's the thing about the travois that matters more than the travois. We think it's ancient. We have almost nothing to prove it. Because a travois is 2 sticks and a strap, and sticks and straps rot. So does rope. So does bark, hide, reed, gut, and fiber, and every raft anybody built before roughly 10,000 years ago. Our entire picture of how humans moved for 300 millennia is assembled out of stone and bone, not because those were the important materials, because those are the 2 that don't decay. Everything soft is gone. Every sling, every basket, every carrying bag, every boat that got anyone anywhere. We're reconstructing the transport history of a species from the small percentage of it that happened to be made of rock. Keep that in mind next time somebody tells you when something was invented. Now, the first thing we ever recruited. In 1914, quarry workers near Bonn, in Germany, uncovered a grave. 2 adults, a man and a woman, stained with red ochre, buried with carved objects made from antler and bone and teeth, about 14,200 years old, and a dog, 7 months old. Somebody went back to that dog's teeth and read them like tree rings. Growth arrests in the enamel at 19 weeks, 21 weeks, 23 weeks. 3 separate episodes. 3 bouts of what looks like canine distemper, a virus that brings fever, vomiting, seizures, and kills most of the animals it gets into. This puppy survived it. 3 times. It could not have done that alone. Somebody fed it by hand, somebody carried water to it. Somebody cleaned up after it for weeks while it was seizing and useless and could not hunt, guard, pull, or do one single thing for them. Then it died anyway at 7 months, and they put it in the ground with them. There was also a molar from a second dog in that grave. Older. Somebody thought to include that too. That's the oldest domestic dog anyone can point at. It's an animal that had no function, kept alive by people with every reason to let it go. I'm not telling you that to warm you up. I'm telling you because that relationship set the template. And the template is what we ran with every animal afterward. Find the one that will tolerate you, feed it until it can't leave. Then find out what it can pull. A few thousand years later, that dog's descendants are hauling sledges across sea ice. 40-odd kilos ahead, 6 of them shift an entire household. Which brings us to the horse, and to the part of the story that was wrong until about 8 years ago. The version you've heard goes like this. Botai, northern Kazakhstan, around 5,500 years ago. Archaeologists find staggering quantities of horse bone, wear on the horse's teeth that looks like damage from a mouthpiece, and fat residue baked into pot sherds that turns out to be mare's milk. Conclusion. These people weren't hunting horses. They were keeping them. First, domestication. It's in every textbook. In 2018, a team sequenced 20 genomes out of Botai and lined them up against dozens of ancient and modern horses. The Botai horses are not the ancestors of any horse alive today. They're the ancestors of Przewalski's horse, which, and this is the part that gets me, is the animal everybody calls the last true wild horse, the one on the conservation posters. The one supposedly never touched by us. It isn't wild. It's feral. It's the escaped remnant of an experiment somebody ran and then abandoned. Modern domestic horses carry roughly 2.7% Botai ancestry. That's the entire inheritance. A rounding error. And it got worse for Botai. In 2021, a separate analysis argued that the famous tooth wear is ordinary dental development and grazing damage, the kind you find on wild horses in North America that never met a person in their lives. There's a rebuttal. It's still being fought. But the live possibility is that the first horse domestication we ever identified wasn't a domestication and led nowhere either way. So where did your horse come from? Also, 2021. 273 ancient horse genomes gathered across Eurasia and arranged in time. And what they show is this. Before about 4,200 years ago, horses were varied. Anatolia had its horses. Iberia had its own. Central Asia, Siberia, the same. Distinct populations, distinct lineages, spread over a continent. Then one lineage comes out of the western steppe, the lower Volga and Don, and inside roughly 1,000 years, every other one is gone. Not diluted, erased. By around 3,000 years ago, essentially every horse on the planet is that horse. Why that one? Because somebody built it. Scan the genomes across time and you can watch the selection happen. Two markers matter. The first is a gene called ZFPM1, and it comes under hard selection about 5,000 years ago. In mice, ZFPM1 modulates anxiety and fear learning. Translation: Step 1 was making them less frightened of you. Taming, visible in the DNA. The second sits near a gene called GSDMC. Selection on it ramps up around 4,750 years ago, and the variant is near universal by 4,150. GSDMC is tied to body proportion and the structure of the spine. Researchers went and knocked it down in mice, and the mice grew straighter backs and stronger forelimbs. Here's the detail I can't get out of my head. In humans, variants around that same gene are strongly associated with chronic back pain. The gene that made the horse rideable is, inside you, a gene about your back hurting. So this wasn't a partnership and it wasn't a discovery. Somebody spent 3 or 4 centuries selecting for an animal that wouldn't panic and wouldn't break under load. That's an engineering program, run without writing, and the specification was, carries a man all day. By around 2000 BC, that animal is moving across Eurasia in lockstep with the rest of the kit. The harness, the tack, the spoke-wheeled chariots coming out of Sintashta on the steppe, horse, vehicle, weapon, all one package. One correction while we're here, because the same study makes it. The popular story says horseback riding powered the Yamnaya expansion off the steppe into Europe around 3000 BC that Indo-European languages wrote in. The genomes say no, that horse doesn't exist yet. Those people moved on foot and in ox carts, and they still replaced a staggering share of Europe's ancestry. The horse didn't shrink the world. The horse made the world reachable, by whoever had one. And now the wheel, which is where the chronology stops making sense. We sailed to Australia 60,000 years before anybody made one. The oldest we've got came out of a bog in Slovenia in 2002, at a site called Stergy Mine in the Ljubljana marshes. Ash wood, 72 centimeters across, built from 2 planks braced together, with a square hole cut through the middle. Next to it, the axle, oak, 124 centimeters. Radiocarbon puts the pair somewhere between 5,100 and 5,350 years old. 2 details from it that I like more than the wheel itself. The tree it was cut from was about 80 years old when they felled it, and the wood had been deliberately scorched, most likely to keep boring insects out. Somebody wasn't just making this thing, somebody was maintaining it. Now, the usual explanation for the delay is the potter's wheel, a spinning disc for clay, and one day somebody tips it onto its side. Maybe. But that framing hides the real problem. The wheel is not the hard part. A disc is easy. Anything with a saw and a log can make a disc. What's hard is the axle. You need a rotating joint that's tight enough not to wobble and loose enough to turn, and you have to cut it in wood, with stone and copper, and hold that tolerance under a load that's trying to tear it apart. Get it 2 millimeters wrong in either direction, and it either seizes solid or shakes itself to bits on the first rut. That's the invention, not the circle, the fit. The Ljubljana wheel solves it by refusing to solve it. The wheel and the axle are wedged together with oak and turn as one rigid unit, and the whole assembly rotates in bearings under the cart. That's a workaround by somebody who knew exactly how badly the alternative goes. Then there's the second problem, which nobody frames as a technology problem at all. A wheel is useless without a surface. Solid wooden wheels crack on rock, sink in mud, and jam on roots. On broken ground, a cart isn't an advantage. It's an anchor with a horse attached. So you need a road. But a road isn't a thing you invent. A road is a thing you maintain. Forever. Which means you need labor. And you need it every year, and you have to extract it from people who would rather be doing something else. That's why the wheel shows up when it shows up. It doesn't arrive with a genius. It arrives with an administration. It turns up in the same few centuries as grain accounting and walled cities, and the ability to make a large number of people do work they didn't choose. Every road on Earth is a standing claim on somebody's labor, and it always has been. Then, around 2000 BC, out on the steppe, somebody works out the spoked wheel. Light, strong, fast. And the first thing humanity does with it is build a chariot. Not a delivery cart. A weapons platform. Let me leave you with a body. In 1991, two hikers found a man melting out of the ice on the Tizenjok Pass, on the border between Italy and Austria, 3,210 meters up. He was about 45. He'd been there about 5,300 years. He had a copper axe with a U-handle, a flint dagger, a quiver with 14 arrows, 61 tattoos, and a decent pair of shoes. For 10 years, everyone assumed the weather got him. Then in 2001, somebody put him through a CT scanner and found a flint arrowhead in his left shoulder. It had been sitting inside him the whole time. Through the recovery, through the autopsy, through a decade of study, it had cut the artery under his collarbone. He was shot from behind. The shaft is missing, which means somebody pulled it out of him. He also had a deep, unhealed gash across his right hand, hours or days old. That's a defensive wound. He'd already been in one fight before the one that killed him. And he was on a pass, 3 kilometers up in the Alps, going somewhere. That's what got him. So run it back. Bipedalism wasn't a breakthrough. It was a crowded field. Most of the entrants are gone, and one of them spent 40 years misfiled as a bear. The Exodus wasn't a march. It was a graveyard with one surviving lineage, and that lineage got through because it had learned to eat bad food in bad places. The first sea crossing wasn't a voyage. It was a natural disaster with survivors, and the survivors got smaller for 500,000 years. The crossings that were deliberate were the most sophisticated logistics anyone on Earth had ever run, and they ended in extinction events. You can dig out of the dirt on every island in the Pacific. The dog started as something we kept alive for nothing and finished as something that pulls. The horse was engineered, selected over centuries for calm nerves and a strong back, and the thing it was built to carry was a man with a weapon. Every other horse lineage on the planet stopped existing, and the wheel arrived attached to a bureaucracy. Every one of those was a response to something going wrong. Not one of them was curiosity. Now you. Today you'll take a trip that would have killed 9 out of 10 people who ever lived, and you'll spend it looking at a phone. And the joke is that if you sit in enough traffic on the way, you'll find yourself moving at roughly the pace of a person on foot. We built the engine, the road, the interchange, the whole enormous apparatus, and at the worst hour of the day, it delivers you at walking speed. You're just doing it sitting down, but go back to that mudflat. Somebody crossed it barefoot in wet clay at almost a run, 1.5 miles, dead straight, and straight matters. Because straight means they knew where they were going and they were not stopping to think about it. They had a child on one hip. When that arm gave out, they moved the child to the other. Twice, maybe more. They set the kid down for a second and picked them back up and kept going. There were mammoths on that flat, sloths, dire wolves, lions. A few hours later, the same feet came back down, the same line, alone. We'll never know what was waiting at the far end. Maybe there was somebody there to hand the child to. Maybe there wasn't. But we know the shape of the walk, and that shape isn't wonder. It isn't the horizon either. That's somebody moving fast, carrying the one thing they couldn't afford to drop, because staying where they were had stopped being an option. That's the walk that filled the planet. Every road on Earth started as somebody's worst day. We paved over it and forgot.